She spent every deployment payment on a life I wasn't part of. Let me tell you about a spreadsheet. I know, not the opening you expected. But this is how I found out. Not with a confrontation, not with a stranger's phone call, not with a dramatic arrival at the wrong moment. A spreadsheet. I am a methodical person. This is not a character flaw. This is what 2 decades of military service produces. A man who documents, reconciles, and reviews. Before every deployment, I set up a budget tracker. I logged what went in, what was supposed to go out, and what should be accumulating over time. I came home after 2 years, 2 back-to-back tours, and I opened the tracker. The numbers didn't match. I didn't panic. I went deeper. Statement by statement, month by month, 24 rows of data, each one a month of my life overseas. What I found was a pattern of withdrawals, small ones, careful ones, the kind that, in any single month, look unremarkable. The kind that only reveal themselves when you lay all 24 months out side by side and trace the shape of them. Money moving from our savings into a second account. An account in Elena's name that I had not known existed. I built a second spreadsheet to map what the savings should have been versus what remained. It took me 3 hours. When I finished, I sat at the kitchen table and looked at the number for a long time. Then I started on a third spreadsheet. This one mapped her movements, weekend withdrawals, hotel-sized charges, restaurant tabs in cities she hadn't mentioned visiting. The incremental financial record of a life I wasn't part of. By the time Elena came home from work, I had 4 spreadsheets open. She walked in. She saw my face. She sat down. She didn't ask what I was doing. That told me something. I turned the laptop toward her and walked her through it, column by column, the way I would brief a team, clearly, calmly, without editorializing. Here is what went in. Here is what should remain. Here is what actually remains. Here is the gap. Here is where the gap went. She listened to the whole thing. When I finished, she was quiet. The rain outside had started while I was talking and was still going. That particular late afternoon rain that settles in without drama and intends to stay. She said she was sorry. She said the deployment had been harder than expected. She said she had needed things she couldn't ask me for. She didn't name the things. I found their names later through more investigation. The second archaeology of a life that had been lived in parallel. Trips, hotels, dinners. The person whose name I eventually learned and then spent a very long time trying to forget. She had built a quiet, ordinary, comfortable life with my deployment payments. Nothing extravagant. Nothing that would raise an obvious flag. Just the normal-looking texture of a life that should have been ours, running alongside someone else. I asked her one question that surprised both of us. I asked, "Were you happy?" She started to cry. I closed the laptop. I got my jacket, my keys. I drove to a petrol station and sat in the car park in the rain and ate a bad sandwich from the shop and looked at nothing in particular. I thought about the spreadsheet, about the clean logic of numbers and dates, about how 2 years can look like a foundation from the outside and be a surface from underneath, about how a pattern only becomes visible when you're willing to look at the whole picture. I drove home, not because things were okay, but because it was my home and the rain was cold and there was nowhere else to be that night. We separated 4 months later. I kept the spreadsheet, not as evidence, not as a weapon, just because I made it carefully and it was true. And I have always believed in keeping things that are true.
He built an entire fake life. I was the real one. The most devastating lie is the one that requires the most work to maintain. Adam had been lying to me for 2 years. Not the ordinary lie, not the crack-in-the-wall lie that requires occasional maintenance and stays in one place. What he had built was a structure, A complete, functional, parallel life with its own address, its own woman, its own ordinary days. 40 minutes from our house. He told me he was deployed. He had served previously. He had the language, the knowledge, the specific credibility of someone who had actually been inside that institution. He knew what deployment looked and sounded like from the inside. He used all of it. Calls from what he said was base. Restrictions on contact, cited plausibly. Occasional visits home in uniform, claiming brief leave. Packages sent deliberately sparse, because real deployments are sparse. He was home every weekend, just not with me. I found out from their daughter. She came to my door on a Wednesday in November. The other woman, with their 4-year-old in a coat too light for the weather. She had found our address in his car. She had been trying to understand why the man she thought she knew kept disappearing on weekends. She had come to the only address that offered an answer. I let them in. We sat at my kitchen table. I made tea. The 4-year-old sat on the kitchen floor and examined the table leg. Outside, rain. The particular November rain I associated with his absences. Those evenings I sat by the front window with the rain on the glass, because something about the enclosure of it was comforting. Something about being held by sound when everything else felt uncertain. Hundreds of evenings at that window. Him 40 minutes away. We talked for 2 hours. 2 women assembling a truth from the pieces each of us had. No competition, no hierarchy. We were on the same side, the only side that mattered. She had things I didn't know. I had things she didn't know. Together, we had more of him than either of us had had alone. He called that evening, warm, checking in, the voice I had organized 2 years of patience and trust around. I let him speak. Then I told him I had company. He went quiet. I told him who was at my table. More quiet. The rain outside. In the kitchen, 2 women, 2 children, the wreckage of 2 parallel lives, and a truth that had finally run out of runway. I stayed on the line. I wanted him to be present for this moment, not as punishment, as the minimum, be awake for what you built. He came the next day. He tried to explain. My daughter, 12 years old, who had been sitting in this kitchen when he called, who had heard everything, looked at him across the table when he finished talking. She asked one question. She said, "Did you ever think about us while you were gone?" He said yes. He said of course. He looked like the word destroyed him. She nodded once. Then she got up and went to her room and closed the door. Quietly. That quiet close was the loudest thing I have ever heard in my life. The rain outside didn't stop that night. It didn't stop the next day either. It just kept going, the way rain does when it has no idea what's happening inside the houses it falls on. Indifferent. Consistent. Real. The way I was going to have to learn to be.